All right, so now we're all set up, and here we go. I'm going to speak with you today about the events in Southern California, and I'm going to start explaining my title, which is provocative. The part of it that's provocative is not climate change, but regime change, and I've got a representation of the regime change. Gavin Newsom speaking to President Biden just a few days ago, looking over the Palisades fire, and then President Trump speaking to Governor Gavin Newsom of California about the Paradise Fire in 2018. And obviously the phrase regime change tends to refer to something more profound than a change in administrations, a change in leadership. It refers to a change in the entire structure of governance. And I do think that there is a sense in which Donald Trump and the MAGA forces that support him, as outlined in Project 2025, do want to try to bring something approaching regime change to the United States. That is to say, change in the structure of governance, a vast increase in unilateral executive power, a decrease in the independence and size of the administrative state, a pivot in the direction of American constitutional law away from liberal democracy and in the direction of what Viktor Orban calls and what Project 2025 endorses as illiberal democracy. But that's not what I'm talking about in terms of regime change. That's topics that we'll be paying attention to. The ability of the incoming administration to succeed in not just changing policy and personnel, but in also changing structures of governance will depend on, first of all, their capacity to legislate, which is very narrow and I think quite questionable, and then also on the courts and whether or not the courts deem these changes constitutional warranted by the election, the mandate that Trump received, but also by constitutional precedent and the way in which that constrains what an incoming administration can do, irrespective of the mandate it receives. What I want to focus on, in a sense, is the policy regime, and the policy regime in particular with regard to climate change and the environment. And here I do want to suggest that what Trump wants to bring about is more obviously and deeply a regime change. This is in the aftermath of, frankly, Joe Biden having brought about a change in the regime of American policy. Biden is by far and away the most aggressive president, has the most accomplishments in terms of climate change policy enacted. We will look in some detail today at what he has accomplished. But I think it's fair to say that the United States has moved from being a laggard to being a leader in global climate change policy under Joe Biden, that the United States belatedly but rapidly transitioned into new energy policy, new transportation policy, new home construction and outfitting policy, into encouraging new green infrastructure and industry development to the tune of over $1 trillion in grants, subsidies, expenditures, and pledges that were brought about by a package of legislation, not only the Inflation Reduction Act, but the Inflation Reduction Act would be the keystone and the trophy in that policy package. And now Donald Trump has campaigned on and is committed to reversing much of that policy. And so when I say a regime change colliding with climate change, Donald Trump has clearly indicated that he would like to reverse most of the elements of the Biden climate policy, that he intends, again, to withdraw us from the Paris Climate Accords, that he does not believe that climate change is real or that it justifies aggressive policy action that surrenders America's advantage with regards to natural gas and petroleum extraction, or that justifies sacrifices, changes in the ways in which we live, the kinds of vehicles we drive, the kinds of houses we live in, and that this then will be a concerted effort on the part of Donald Trump to undo the policies of his predecessor. This will be the second time Trump will be president and will direct a fair bit of his energy and initiative, not per se at a constructive policy, but at a policy that undoes what he sees to be the destructive policy of his predecessor. And as I say all of this, Los Angeles is burning, right? And for those of us, it's hard to escape paying attention to this at the moment, but 150,000 people displaced, 11,000 structures destroyed, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 people confirmed killed. Likely that that number will increase, though frankly merciful that that number is so low. But when we look at the geographic dimensions of this fire, it covers an area that I should say fires, right? Because at this point there are four discrete fires at least burning in all four quadrants of Los Angeles County, most of them not in Los Angeles City proper, but nevertheless, this is, like many American metropolitan areas, essentially a continuous area of relatively densely populated housing. And this is really the nightmare scenario, an urban conflagration and basically uncontained, right? The biggest fires, 10%, 15% contained. What that means is that the majority of the perimeter of the fire, 85%, 90%, is able to spread in a way that fire officials have no confidence in their ability to prevent it from spreading in those directions. And we add to that the Santa Ana winds, the very high winds that come in from the eastern desert, are returning and slated to be relatively powerful. When I say relatively powerful, just extremely powerful, right? Gusts of 50 to 100 miles an hour over the next 5 days, all the way through Wednesday of the coming week. And of course, fire tends to spread more or less at the speed of wind. And so we're talking about the potential of these fires spreading at 50 to 100 miles an hour as those gusts carry embers from burning structures to currently untouched structures, and then the fire spreads out from a new epicenter. So all of that to say, right, we are seeing in Los Angeles today what I think most people who've been concerned about climate change for, let us say, a quarter century. And of course, the petroleum industry has been aware for at least 50 years, arguably 75 years, that their commercial enterprise is likely to have effects that generate these new climatic conditions. But those of us who've been talking about this for a quarter century have been saying either we act now or this is what the future holds. And it appears that the future has arrived and that it is grim, that it is apocalyptic, that it carries with it destructive capacities that we do not know how to contain or prevent, and that will change the character of life on Earth. And so the background question that motivates me to focus on this topic and to talk about it in such frankly alarmist language is the question of whether or not there's any possibility Los Angeles burning on the eve of Donald Trump's inauguration will moderate his commitment to dismantling what progress we've made on climate policy over the last 4 years. That progress, to be as clear as possible, is limited, is insufficient, is not enough to meet our own goals, the goals of the United Nations for us, or most importantly, obviously, the objective of averting the worst catastrophic aspects of climate change. But having said that, at least we have pivoted, moved in the right direction. We're bending the arc of our energy policy, of our way of life, to be more sustainable, to be less self-destructive. And yet, already, the consequences of climate change are on our doorstep and profoundly altering life in the United States. Will that have any impact on the incoming president? That's the question in the background motivating today's class. Let me start just, and I don't want to dwell on this, but with a little bit of information about what's happening in Los Angeles. Starting with an actual satellite map from a day ago. And so, as you're probably aware, Los Angeles sits in what is naturally a desert basin, and it covers a large area, not just Los Angeles proper, but various communities that surround Los Angeles. And there are now major fires burning to the northwest of Los Angeles, I'm sorry, to the southwest of Los Angeles, as well as to the northeast of Los Angeles. Fires that look smaller by comparison, burning elsewhere, but these are actually large, uncontained, dangerous fires, just dwarfed by comparison with the mega fires burning in the heart of America's second largest city. A little bit of information, more detailed, about three of the largest fires, and then a little bit of a effort to represent the winds, right? And so the lines on this map represent the direction and the strength of the winds blowing into Los Angeles from the northeast. And what is hard to capture is the force of those winds. But these winds are blowing 50 to 100 miles an hour. And to just speak for a moment about the background, and the background here is complicated, but the idea that on the one hand, the power of those winds is amplified by the increased energy in Earth's atmosphere caused by gases that humanity has emitted over the last 150 years, over the period of an industrial economy developing in Europe and the United States and then spreading to the rest of the world, and that those gases trap more of the sun's energy in our atmosphere and then amplify the pre-existing patterns like the Santa Ana winds. And those winds now blow over a longer period with more force than they used to blow. But you add to that, right, that this is a desert basin that is irrigated primarily from water drawn from elsewhere, and that California has been intermittently in droughts over the last several years. There is a lot of dry brush, the detritus of trees, fuel for fires, and then you add, especially for instance with the Eaton fire, that the so-called human wildlife interface, right? How much distance is there between where we build our habitations, our industry, and where the forests and the more wild, unsettled lands are, and that we just keep pushing further and further. Los Angeles is the second largest city, millions of people. The cost of living is extremely high. People want less expensive places. It's also highly desirable to live at the coast, close to the forests and the hills. And so people push into those areas. The result is that it's very difficult to let a forest fire, which does constructive work, right? That it burns off some of that compiled fuel that otherwise generates a mega fire that's harder to contain. It's actually good for the flora of the forest to have the heat, to generate the carbon that actually is a nutrient for many of the trees in the forest. We know indigenous Americans regularly set forest fires if the forest did not burn of their own accord, very often every 6 or 7 years, because we've pushed our homes and lives so far into the forest. It's very difficult to let a forest fire burn or to have a controlled burn without threatening those homes. It is also the case that the people who live proximate to the forest don't want the threat of smoke. It is very hazardous for air quality to have a fire burning proximate to you. And so the result is that there's been this vast
Yeah.
accumulation of fuel for
Do
these
I
fires.
have what?
And the
Yes, thank you.
result now is that they are burning with an intensity, a ferocity that is uncharacteristic of previous fires. I'll add urban fires have their own dynamics. We're familiar with, for instance, the firebombing of Dresden in Germany during World War II, and that once a critical mass of a city starts to burn, very often the city contains its own fuel for the fire. California is among the most aggressive states in requiring fire safety for new construction, in requiring that there be a quote defensible perimeter around a home in order to prevent the fire from spreading to the home and to allow firefighters the access necessary to fight the fire. And yet this is right still raging in the heart of the largest city in California. The scale of the destruction and devastation is really hard to imagine. It is the case that an area the size of Manhattan has burned. Fortunately, nothing like the population density of Manhattan, but nevertheless, 150,000 people are now under evacuation orders. Tens of thousands of people have lost their homes. And when you look at this from the Altadena neighborhood, right, that's, I guess, 2 square blocks that you're seeing beautiful big homes with pools, and not a single one of them, or maybe one or two, remain in the aftermath of these fires. And this gives you a sense, again, of the scale of the devastation. We're looking at, right, uh, dozens of square miles in these maps, and everywhere that there's orange in these maps, there is property destruction. So again, just a devastating fire in terms of its human impact. I find this map to be very scary, right? So this is a crescent in red here that stretches for roughly 100 miles, all the way from Oxnard down to Oceanside in terms of its north to south dimensions, and at its broadest, almost 50 miles across, where there is critical fire risk, right? And so this is not the size of the current fire, but this is the worry, right? That this fire continues to spread. And now, just to speak to this for a moment, we're dealing with the limits of our capacity to manage the forces we have unleashed. The greater wind strength, the greater stock of combustible fuel, the dynamics of a mega fire. Once it gets started, it sets up new convection wind forces that throw the embers a mile high into the sky, and then they descend in various directions. And if they come back to Earth, still aglow and hit something that is combustible, the fire spreads incredibly rapidly. We don't know yet what caused this fire. There's speculation that it may be power lines that were left on during these very high winds over very dry conditions. And as people in Northern California know painfully well, that's a recipe for disaster, right? And so the power cables may have come down, may have caused electrical sparks to incinerate the combustible material on the ground. We will have to wait and see. We also know that there is a shortage of water, that the high wind speeds make it very difficult for planes and helicopter to carry ocean water to dump on these fires, and that the supply coming through the hydrant and pipe system is severely diminished. Again, this indicates the limits of our capacity. But here I just want to say, in a sense, the infrastructure of Los Angeles, and this would be as true or probably more true of almost every other major American city, is 20th century infrastructure. It was built for a moment in climate history that is no longer in place. It was built for a different world, a world in which, frankly, a fire of this size had very little likelihood of ever occurring. And in this new world, we have to choose our priorities. And I'll say this in the abstract and thinking in the long term. In the first instance, we have three competing tasks and certainly not limitless resources, so we have to decide how to prioritize between them. On the one hand, we should be doing everything in our power to prevent further future climate change, right? And I will throw out the figure of $1 trillion. It's a hard figure to even conceive or measure, but that's roughly what the Biden administration has pledged to spend on the green transition in our economy. And as we'll see, it's almost certainly insufficient. And the same breath, it is staggering the amount that they're proposing to spend, right? And having said that, that's just one bundle. The second bundle is mitigation as opposed to prevention. We are already unleashing the forces of climate change. This is what we're seeing in Los Angeles. This is what we're seeing in North Carolina. This is what we're seeing in Puerto Rico. This is what we're seeing in Spain. This is what we're seeing in the ice sheets in Greenland and Iceland and the melting ice caps in the Antarctic and the Arctic. This will be expensive, right? I don't have any idea what the budget will be because we don't know what the extent of the damage will be. But I am confident that the amount that will be required to rebuild Los Angeles or to relocate people if they decide that the areas that have been devastated are either too devastated or too dangerous to rebuild, we will spend billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. I'm not sure how much to compensate for that damage, right? That's the third pile. Compensation. Mitigation is the second pile. What can we do to harden our infrastructure, to protect our homes, to build the capacity that we need to fight these fires, to handle the extreme weather, to anticipate and be able to cope with multiple simultaneous intersecting crises. This is the future we face. And to state the obvious, if we end up spending billions, tens or hundreds of billions on the aftermath of the Los Angeles fires, we will have less left for mitigation, less left for prevention. And I worry, frankly, that we find ourselves in a cycle where we are preventing or we're failing to prevent climate change. We are failing to mitigate its effects because we're spending so much of our resources, so much of our energy, so much of our initiative and intelligence on just cleaning up after the mess, after the loss, after the catastrophe of an unrelenting series of climate crises. So, how did we get here? And here I'll suggest, right, that we have fundamentally altered the planet. We have rendered it, in the language I like, much more vulnerable than it's ever been. It was, for the entirety of the period of the spread of human civilization, going back 10,000 years, a basically resilient planet. There was very little we could do that it couldn't recover from. But now that there are 8 billion of us in an energy and resource intensive way of life, it is no longer resilient. It is no longer vulnerable. And so to focus just for a moment on the basic correlation, and this is a simplification, but it's a useful simplification. How much have we increased the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere over the last 125 years? And this shows you emissions by year, not concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but the carbon dioxide goes up into the atmosphere and it stays there a very long time. The idea that in 1900 we were emitting less than 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year, and that by the time we get to 2024, we are emitting over 40 gigatons per year. A lot of this has to do with industrialization, and in particular, as you can see, the big uptick begins in the middle of the 20th century as slowly but surely the Soviet Union, China, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Brazil, some of the most populous areas in the world that had been left out of the initial wave of European and American industrialization, start to industrialize and don't think this is over, right? They are still struggling to electrify their society. They are still struggling to create a modern transportation infrastructure. They have rising middle classes, and those middle classes want things like automobiles and beef that are highly carbon intensive or productive of other greenhouse gases. So all of that to say, right, this is indicative of a still uncontrolled destructive trend in carbon emissions on a global scale. This is the temperature, right? And as you can see, this is the average in the late 19th century that's taken to be the the pre-industrial average temperature. And from 1940 to 1980, we essentially exceed the pre-industrial average by less than half a degree, going up and down somewhat year by year, and yet not terribly alarming in terms of the trend line. Beginning in the late 1970s, again, industrialization in China and India are the big drivers here. the carbon is going up and the temperature is going up in tandem, right? And I think you can see a pretty clear correlation between these lines. Not that it's perfect or that the time frames exactly match, but generally speaking, this is what climate science predicts: increased heat trapping, energy trapping gases in the atmosphere, and the temperature will go up. We've talked about the analogy before that this is like parking your car in a hot parking lot on a hot day with lots of sun shining down. If you're smart, you crack your windows, right? And you let some of the heat that's going to accumulate in your car because the sun's energy is coming in, but the windows trap the air in the car, you let some of that heat get out through the open window. And when our atmosphere had less heat trapping or energy trapping gases in it, our planet radiated some of the sun's energy back into the atmosphere. As we've increased the carbon in our atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, we have rolled up the windows on our atmosphere, decreased the capacity of the energy to escape, and just as predicted, the temperature is going up and up. Now, we've talked about this extensively before. I was doing a little bit of math before I spoke with you. We've been talking together. This is the 9th year, right? And over that time, I believe I've spoken with you about climate change over 20 times, right? And sometimes a whole series, sometimes a more individualized event. But we've been talking about this for a long time. You may remember the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issues a report every few years. They have lowered the threshold of concern. If we get over 1.5 degrees Celsius global temperature increase, they are warning us that we are wandering into a minefield. We don't know how we will navigate the tipping points. Will the ice sheets in Greenland just collapse? Will the ice caps begin a period of accelerated destabilization that we will find impossible to reverse? One moment. Will the melting of the permafrost release large amounts of methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as the biomass stored there thaws and deteriorates, right? Lots of places where things once started are very hard to reverse. Will we see more and more fires? And of course, fires burn carbon dioxide sequestering trees and release the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. If you can see, in 2024, we passed the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. So we are in the minefield right now. This has something to do with the oceanic phenomenon known as El Nino. It's not just the carbon dioxide and other heat trapping gases. And the hope certainly is when El Nino subsides, when La Nina returns, that we will see the temperature come back down a little bit. But please note, right, this is the highest temperature, not just recorded in the last 80 plus years, really in the last 10,000 years, so far as we can tell, based on the ice cores, which give us pretty precise ways of estimating planetary temperature. And please note, right, that the year before, 2023, was also a record-breaking year, the highest recorded temperature. And please note that 5 of the records in the planetary temperature have occurred in the last decade. We are uncontrollably increasing the temperature on the planet. Just to give you a quick sense of the path not taken, it's reasonable to say that as early as 2005, there was a scientific consensus and sufficient public awareness that we could have started taking action on a global scale then, if we had the will, if we had the capacity, if we had the governmental structure that allowed us to. And if we had launched that path in 2005, it would have been much more moderate, much more gradual adaptation to a less energy intensive economy and way of life, but we did it. Had we waited a decade and done it in 2015 instead, it would have been more accelerated, right? And it would have had to proceed more quickly because we have, in the intervening decade, emitted more carbon dioxide. And so we have a shorter runway in which to land the Earth into the safe territory. We did enact in 2015. Here we are a decade later. And now, as opposed to a gradual or an accelerated descent, we need a crash landing, right? We need essentially an almost instantaneous reduction of the amount of carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere, right? Reducing it 10%, 20% a year for the next decade. And this is impossible, right? I shouldn't say it that way. This is not going to happen, right? It's not impossible, but it would take a commitment, a level of will, a level of sacrifice that, given that rather than doing anything in 2005, 2015, rather than reducing the arc of increased carbon dioxide, the only time we seem to do that is when we have a global pandemic or a severe recession. We have continued instead to accelerate. And so we're almost certainly bound to have more than 1.5 degrees temperature increase to increasingly inhabit a deeply altered planet. That is what I think Los Angeles bodes for us. It's a window, alas, into what the future is going to look like. Having said that, policy matters, right? And so now I want to shift a little bit from why Los Angeles is burning to what we can, what we have, and what we may no longer do about it. And so I'm going to focus first on the Inflation Reduction Act and then more broadly on the Biden administration. This is the work of Jesse Jenkins at Princeton University. It's rather technical, as the diagram and the subtext may reveal, but what he does is try to work through a whole bunch of different models with a whole bunch of different assumptions and ask, where were we headed relative to different scenarios? For instance, how much does natural gas cost? How much does gasoline cost? How much do batteries hold, and how much do they cost? How much do photovoltaic cells cost, right? There are a whole bunch of assumptions you got to make. And so rather than making only one assumption, consider multiple scenarios, right? And so please note, worst case, right? The United States was on path before Biden legislated, before the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Act, the American Recovery Act, all of which, right? It's a suite of legislation, all of which have green initiatives built into it. Before any of that legislation passed, we were still on path to reduce our carbon emissions by about 25% in 2035. We are now much closer to reducing emissions by 45, 50% by 2025, depending on which scenario plays out. I won't go into the details here, but note that there are many components to this, and this reflects the complexity of the legislation, whether this is creating new sources of renewable or sustainable energy, or changing our transportation infrastructure, or changing our electrical infrastructure. Obviously, multiple things happening at the same time, changing the way industry works, changing the way houses are built or retrofitted. All of this contributes to these scenarios. But I hope this is clear, right? That this gets us closer to the target, right? Of having our greenhouse gas emissions 50% below where they were in 2005, not quite all the way there. And I think that's important to see. Even our best efforts, even what could get passed with Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin being essentially the critical votes in the Senate, enough got passed and enough was built into the legislation in terms of incentives, in terms of subsidies, and there is enough of an appetite on the part of industry, on the part of consumers for these new technologies, these new capacities, that we have perhaps doubled the rate at which we are transitioning to a sustainable economy. Still not fast enough. And obviously, the United States can't do this by itself. I think this is, in a sense, the most credible card that Donald Trump has to play against these initiatives. Why should we unilaterally do this stuff when China and India, the big players, are not doing it fast enough for what we do to matter? That is absolutely correct. And yet, if we don't act, we have no credibility. We have no leadership capacity to urge people in other parts of the world to also act more rapidly. Looking more generally at the Biden scorecard, right? Set target to cut emissions by at least 50% by 2030. They are reasonably successful, right? So they want to say that goal is achieved. I think that might be slightly optimistic. Pass a major climate smart stimulus package, right, after COVID-19, done. Tackle super pollutants. This is especially methane escaping from fracking and drilling operations. That has also been done via both legislation and regulation. We're going to get into that distinction in a moment. That which is done by legislation tends to be more stable, right? Because new legislation is required to undo it. That which is done by executive action, by regulatory action, less stable, because with the sign of a pen, Donald Trump can undo that initiative. Require all new passenger vehicles produce zero emissions by 2035. Obviously, California and 14 other states are doing this. The federal government is doing reasonably well. Significant progress, though not achieved. Scale up carbon removal. And here I'll just emphasize for a moment what I have shared with you, right? And we go back to this diagram. We've already crossed the threshold into the minefield. Hopefully we'll come back down with a La Nina sets in, but we're still well on our way to being permanently over 1.5 degrees Celsius, headed towards 2 degrees. That's a very destructive scenario to be on. This may seem like, to put it in its most provocative way, frankly, we're doomed. How can, given the fact that we haven't managed to reverse or even contain our addiction to carbon-based fuels in the last 50 years, how can we really anticipate that we're going to dramatically reduce our consumption over the next 50 years? The one bright spot, the one hope, I think, on the horizon is that we get much better at removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Carbon removal is the most important. And when the World Resource Institute says significant progress has been made on carbon removal, I'm not sure whether to agree or disagree, right? Investment is being made, new regulations are being promulgated, and yet it is, to use the old metaphor, draining the ocean with a teaspoon. We don't have the capacity. It can't be scaled. It's not cost effective to pull the carbon back out of the atmosphere yet. We are removing a tiny little bit of what we're putting in. So sorry to keep toggling between the diagrams. So the result is, even with, right, pulling a little bit of carbon out, our overall concentration of carbon in the atmosphere keeps going up, our overall temperature keeps going up, and it's hard to conceive right now of the technology that allows us to actually begin to pull out of the atmosphere more carbon than we're putting into it. We hope we can get there. We hope that there will be some big breakthrough. One place where I might be critical of the Biden administration is to suggest what we really need is something akin to the Manhattan Project in this regards, a moonshot, a right vast investment of resources that makes this a national priority. And we didn't really get that under Biden. I think it's pretty fair to say, unless one of the billionaire oligarchs whispering in Trump's ear manages to uh, direct his attention to this issue, I don't see us doing this in the near future. So carbon scale up carbon removal, not really where we need to be. Ramp up clean electricity standards. Well, some was done again by executive action primarily. Set appliance and equipment standards to replace fossil fuels with electricity whenever feasible. Lots of subsidies and incentives, but not being taken up to the same degree, for instance, that the vehicle incentives are being taken up. Set emissions performance standards for cement, steel, and plastics. Hugely important, a large source of greenhouse gases. As we expand our footprint in this country and the human species on the planet, we produce more and more cement, steel, plastic. We have to be able to do that in ways that do not have the emissions we have right now. We haven't been able to reestablish international leadership. Hard to know exactly what that means, but I am confident that we will not continue in that direction over the next 4 years. Finally, and I think most importantly, almost every economist who studies this and who takes it seriously says, if you really want to get to the place, look at these scenarios where, right, you're gradually reducing or sharply reducing or reducing at an incredibly accelerated rate the rate of climate emissions. You have to tax those emissions. You'll have to give me 1 second. Somebody's at my door. With apologies, I'll be right back. Happy New Year. Sorry about that. My door is working right now. So all of this to say, right, policy really does matter. The Biden administration made this one of its top three priorities. It had limited capacity to legislate. It did, I think, really quite remarkably, given how narrow its margin was in the Senate, given that it had to use reconciliation to get this legislation passed. It also relied on executive action. And I think one of the things that we should note, sorry, there's a little duplication here, but let me talk for a moment about this, right? The idea that we have our climate target, right, and our historical emissions, right? So we're not quite to where our target should be, part of the reason that this is the case, and let me go back for one moment with apologies. I think I got a little off track with the interruption. Taxing pollution, right? And the idea that economists think that this is really the only way to ultimately produce the accelerated transition to sustainable energy and lifestyles that we require. One way to think about this is to say the cost of cleanup in Los Angeles. We have no idea what it's going to be, but it's certainly going to be uh, enumerated in the billions. Whether it's going to be tens of billions, hundreds of billions, it's going to be very expensive, right? And who should pay for that? I think one way to think about this is, well, the people who caused it, right? And who caused it? Well, there's very good evidence that the petroleum industry has known for over 50 years, right? Has done some of the pioneering research on climate change and then buried that research and then actually paid for research that contradicted its own research and then right tried to promote the idea that the research was muddy or not clear, right? Merchants of doubt. We refer to this strategy following the book and the movie, right? The idea that the industry most responsible should bear a substantial portion of the cost would involve taxing petroleum much higher. But then please note, all of us are complicit. I think we have to acknowledge. I was in California last week. I flew on a plane to get out there. I do that less than I used to, and I still feel guilty about doing it because I know that I am contributing unsustainably to greenhouse gases. I come out because there are people I love that I want or need to see, and so I make a compromise, but I'm not comfortable with that compromise. Having said that, if we taxed emissions from airplanes, from automobiles, it would be the case that we could drive down the number of people who are engaged in destructive, unsustainable behavior and not forced to pay the costs. The problem is, and this is where things get sticky, right? Half the country has seen its income stagnate while the cost of living has gone up. You have what was a relatively modest and short bout of inflation, and the rage that it generates, the discontent that it generates, makes it such that the administration that did this good work is not able to continue. And as opposed to that, you have somebody coming in who's going to do his best to dismantle this good work. The backlash against Macron in France by the Yellow Vest when he proposed increased gas prices, right, increased gas taxes, means that in a sense, the best policy tool that we have is a political non-starter, political poison. Nobody's willing to touch it. And so then we go forward for a moment. We are not hitting our targets, and we probably need something like tax to hit our targets. We, as a society, are decreasing our use of coal, and thank God we are, right? And dramatically, right? This is measured in the amount of electricity we get. You can see 2006 to 2016, coal was still king, was still the number one source of energy in the United States. The expense associated with coal, in part due to the regulation of it, has driven down the amount of coal we use. And note, right, that renewables have come up, but not as quickly as natural gas. And while natural gas is cleaner than coal, it is still emitting greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide. And the issue is, of course, natural gas is cheaper and reliable. You can burn natural gas when the wind isn't blowing, when the sun isn't shining, and If you're a utility company, the fundamental demand of your customers is that you keep those prices down. Burning natural gas allows them to do that. And this is why we are not meeting our targets. Whether or not, right, the Biden policies are successful depends not only on what happens to our energy system, right? Please note that electricity, the demand for electricity is rising and obviously being met by more natural gas being burned. Why is the demand for electricity rising? Well, in part because we're driving more electrical vehicles. That's perhaps a good thing, but frankly, a better thing would be to reduce the number of vehicles we're driving. Yes, we should replace gas with electric, but we should also probably reduce the number of vehicles being driven in our country by 50%. That involves having more public transportation, better alternatives to each family having an automobile or two, which is essentially all but compulsory to have a middle class life in the United States today. But it's not just the electrical vehicles, it's also the fact that we like our devices, that we like our computers, our phones, that we are using more and more artificial intelligence and social media, and they are energy guzzlers. The fact that we are building new factories that are part of the green revolution, well, they're soaking up a lot of energy, a lot of electricity as well. Having said that, let me focus for a second on, right, this is existing EV and solar factories in gray, newly announced EV and solar factories in mustard on a map of Georgia, right? And the reason we concentrate on Georgia is because there's a strategy here, right? Biden's energy policy is designed to create a constituency for its continuation over time. Frankly, this didn't happen quickly enough for Biden or Harris to win in 2024, right? But if you look at where the money is being spent, the money that is allocated by the Inflation Reduction Act, billions of dollars are going almost exclusively to red states. You look at Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, which is more a purple state, right? 21 billion dollars. And the idea is to try to create a constituency within those red states such that their senators, their congresspeople are less willing to vote to revoke the policy that is generating jobs in their economy. And so let me conclude today but by talking about, on the one hand, right, as I've said, that executive action can be undone by executive action. Everything that Biden has done simply by signing an executive order, it's quite likely that Trump will undo by contravening it with another executive order. But a fair bit of what Biden has done is legislative, and that will require legislation to undo it. Will Congress actually have the capacity to pass legislation that undoes, for instance, the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act? I want to be as clear as possible. One thing that could happen here is simply that Trump will appoint to key executive branch positions people who are skeptical of this legislation, who will therefore drag their feet, make it more difficult, create impediments, bureaucracy to get in the way, and so less of the funds will be allocated. That will almost certainly end up in the courts, right? And the question will be how obvious the delay strategy is and whether or not a court will say, no, you have to actually administer this law. This law has not been revoked. But the other possibility, of course, is that Trump and the Republican Party will actually try to revoke elements of these laws. And here I want to suggest the big question is, will ideology trump economics? Excuse the use of Trump. Will ideology supersede economics, right? And they're right. This legislation is creating new jobs, good jobs, union jobs. It is pumping money into some of the poorest regions, the poorest states in the United States. It is, irrespective of what you think about climate change, a good economic development policy. Will the animus to the very idea of climate change as right, something that elites and experts and scientists and liberals care about, and therefore if you're not part of that fake news group, you should be opposed to, will that ideology be more important than the economic benefit of this policy? I'm a little worried that the ideology seems to be more powerful than economic interest in the 21st century. This has a fair bit to do with what we've been talking about for weeks now, what's happening with social media, what's happening with the new media environment. But this will be a test case. So I think that's one of the things to be looking at as we move forward. Why don't I stop what I have to say there, open it up to your questions, concerns, thoughts. I should have said this at the outset. I suspect we may all have friends and relatives in Los Angeles. I hope everybody who you're connected to is all right, and communicating with you to let you know that they're all right. There's a human dimension to this that we need to have in mind while we talk about the politics. All right, who wants to start us out with a thought or comment today? When I'm there in person, I can barely contain you. I guess the medium matters, right? Anybody want to say something about this, Flossie? Go ahead. Unmute yourself, please. You're not unmuted yet. Yes, I know. You're still muted, Flossie. I don't know if you, so you've got to hold that space bar down or hit that icon. There you go. Good.
Just to remember that we had a Mr. Gore a long time ago, and not so long, and we managed to get rid of him so neatly.
Say that one more time, Flossie. Say it again.
Remember Al Gore?
Al Gore. Okay, that's what I thought you were saying. I just couldn't make it out. Yes.
Yes. We managed to get rid of him very neatly.
Yes. Yes. And it's kind of why I want to point to around 2000 as the moment at which, look, it's just inescapable, right? Maybe we should have known about this in 1980. The research that Keeling's doing, generating the Keeling curve, right? That's in the 1950s. There's a governmental report under Eisenhower saying that this is inevitably the path we're on. So, right, again, maybe 75 years ago, there was some awareness of this, but by the time we get to 2000, it's public knowledge. It's inescapable. The only people who are denying it are people who are putting their heads in the sand or letting their ideology hijack their responsiveness to scientific research. And so, yes, Al Gore, I think, is pivotal in really making this an inescapable national conversation. And yet, yes, we didn't elect him. We didn't listen to him. And when I say we, look, California has been very progressive on this issue. One of the reasons I start with that, picture of Gavin Newsom talking to both Joe Biden and Donald Trump is it seems to me that over the next 4 years, if there's going to be important climate change action taken, it's probably going to have to occur at the state level as opposed to at the national level. Yeah, thank you for the good comment, Flossie. Dale, are you trying to talk? I see you've got yourself unmuted.
Um, Obviously, the need to increase non-fossil energy is important. Uh, where do you see the possibility of nuclear uh, power generation being?
I think it's extraordinarily important. I was worried you were going to ask me about hydrogen, which I think is also important, but requires a scientific expertise I don't have to talk about. I grew up in California in the 1980s. I grew up as part of people who were adamantly anti-nuclear in their approach to thinking about the downside risks as opposed to the upside advantage. It's still the case that storing nuclear fuel is very difficult and very dangerous. But having said that, what we're seeing in Los Angeles indicates that there is a countervailing danger that you've got to put on the other side of the scale. And frankly, I don't think green energy can be reliable enough, can be plentiful enough, right? Those are two different questions. Not just how much can we make, but how much can we store so that we have it when the sun isn't shining, when the wind isn't blowing. And so we need some alternative to this renewable, sustainable sources because hydrogen isn't there yet, because fusion isn't there yet. We do need nuclear as part of the mix. I think probably for the next 50 years. It took me a while to become convinced of this, but yes, I am convinced of this in light of our total failure to bring carbon emissions under control over the last 50 years. Yeah, thank you. Good comment, Dale. Thank you. David, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask a similar question to Dale's. And, you know, uh, we've looked into this issue about risk related to different forms of energy production and the like. And the risk to human life with nuclear is actually less than just about any other form of energy production. Chernobyl and Three Mile Island notwithstanding, the number of lives lost to nuclear accidents is minuscule compared to the production of fossil fuel energy and the loss of life there, both direct as a result of accidents and indirect as a result of pollution and the like. So I think if you take a risk management perspective, nuclear looms large as a key part in this portfolio. And the other thing that we realized, and we've had a very active uh, presence here at Piedmont Gardens and trying to educate ourselves about climate change and climate action. And I think one of the conclusions we've come to is that you need a full and diverse portfolio. That is, it isn't any one of these things that's going to work. And part of it is going to be, I guess, I don't know what halfway in between green and brown energy is, but sort of like sapient energy production, and that is the least worst of the fossil fuel alternatives is going to have to be a part of that portfolio for the short-term future, and with some idea of gradually eliminating those sources in favor of greener sources. But I think it's going to be a long time before hydrogen and fusion appear at all practical. So I think that at scale, nuclear has to be a part of our consideration. And there are new nuclear developments, these modular ones, these small units that are very mobile and can be moved into places that would serve much smaller populations and the like. So it has that capacity, which, as near as I can tell, most other forms, most fossil fuel production sources don't have. Solar clearly has that, that modular mobility attribute too. So I think between solar and nuclear is maybe our best alternatives.
Yeah, thank you, David. And I won't get into the risk management literature. I think there's some technical stuff like so. Not that many people die. How many people had their lives shortened by months or years by Chernobyl? That's a little harder to estimate exactly. But let me pivot instead to energy and just think for a moment about other alternatives. And the one that I think a lot of people are excited about is so-called biomass fuel with carbon sequestration. And so you grow trees or plants that you can burn that pull carbon out of the atmosphere. Frankly, we still don't have a technology as efficient as a tree for pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, right? That's what photosynthesis does. That's how trees grow. And then you burn those trees to generate electricity, but you capture the carbon that's released and you sequester it. You put it back into the planet deep underground in the rocks that store it, and you have generated electricity and done carbon capture at the same time. This is not yet viable as a major source, commercially viable as a major source of electricity. But this is the kind of thing, and I didn't really talk about the details here, but right, the Loan Program Office at the Department of Energy sees its funding increase from 40 billion to 400 billion under the Inflation Reduction Act. How many of us know that Tesla got a $460 million loan from the Loan Program Office in the Department of Energy that allowed it from being a niche manufacturer of a two-seater coupe to a major, the largest, right, electrical vehicle producer in the United States, one of the largest in the world, right? That's what the right government can do when it puts money into promoting green technology. And frankly, we need to be funding the development of new, cleaner energy sources. Yes, absolutely. I agree with that, David. Anybody else with anything else for today?
We need to be changing our curriculum too. The
Yes.
public schools need to be made aware, and the private schools too.
Well, and the one thing I'll say here, Flossie, is I think that there's a generational divide here. I think a lot of young people are aware, and they're not just aware,
They're
they're
scared.
combination of scared and angry. Scared because, if they have children, will their children actually be able to live the course of their natural lives without being in some sort of climate nightmare scenario, right? Some sort of awful conditions. And on the other hand, angry because, of course, it's us who are doing all the damage and failing to manage it, right? Angry at the generations prior to them who are leaving them with such wreckage, with such a hard problem to manage. And so I don't disagree with you about the importance of education. I just think, in a sense, when the force of education is, will my children inherit an inhabitable planet or not, the education almost happens naturally, organically, not just through school curricula. All right, everyone. Good. Michael, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that on nuclear, that the France now gets almost all of its nuclear generation, all of its electric generation from nuclear power, and has demonstrated that it can be done and done safely.
Yeah,
That's
no, I think both what you and Dale and David are saying is absolutely right, which is that there are the smaller scale reactors are not just mobile, they're safer, right? Um, and that we are better at storing the waste than we have been in the past. We still have to be very careful. It's still radioactive for a very long time, but that in light of the absolute emergency with climate change, we should absolutely be pivoting to whatever works to allow us to reduce our reliance on carbon-based fuel, to stop burning stuff to get our energy provided. All right, everyone. Good being with you again. Uh, we will have plenty to talk about next week as this change in regimes takes hold. Until then, be well. Look forward to talking with you soon. Bye, everybody. Take care. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, David.
Pleasure as always. Thank you. Bye bye.